let's see, although do I see Peter?
I don't see Peter. I haven't heard him yet.
Okay, should we give him a couple minutes?
Yeah, because I just texted like 15-20 seconds ago.
I thought I saw him pop up here a little bit ago.
I didn't see that. Doesn't mean it didn't happen though.
Chair Cruz, we've got 4 commissioners. I would recommend we just get started.
Okay. All right, the May 15, 2023 Prosper Portland Board of Commissioners meeting is now convened. Pam, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Platt? Commissioner Rodriguez?
Aye.
Commissioner Stoudemire Wesley?
Present.
Commissioner Myers?
Aye.
Chair Cruz?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a brief notice to read. As required by state law, Prosper Portland provides an opportunity for the public to attend its meetings in person. As such, we have provided a publicly accessible room in the Love Portland Conference Room on the 2nd floor of 2020 Northwest 2nd Avenue. The public has the opportunity to arrange in advance to provide both virtual and in-person testimony. At this time, the public may provide written testimony to the commission by emailing prospercommissioners@prosperportland.us. Again, prospercommissioners@prosperportland.us. Okay, next up, we will approve the minutes for the April 12, 2023 meeting. Would anybody like to make a motion to approve the minutes for April 12, 2023?
So moved.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Still
Second.
second.
Okay, great. All those in favor of approving those minutes?
Aye.
Great. All right. Okay. Passes unanimously. And then back to public comment. Do we have any public comment, Pam?
Nope.
We do not.
Okay. All right. Well, just as I mentioned earlier, you can send any public comment by email to prospercommissioners@prosperportland.us. So the first item we have today is an action item. This is authorizing utility easement and amending the terms of a disposition and development agreement to convey approximately 4.4 acres of Prosper Portland owned property in the River District Tax Increment Financing District. Sarah Harpole is here to present today. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Cruz, Commissioners, Executive Director Banham. My name is Sarah Harpel. I'm a Senior Project Manager in the Development and Investment Department at Prosper Portland. I'm before you today to present 2 interrelated actions. Before I begin, I do just want to acknowledge that while I'm before you, this body of work also was an effort in partnership with Hope Whitney. And so the 2 of us are here to answer any questions at the end of today's presentation. Do we have, there we go. Next slide, please. The 2 actions before you, the first is to grant an easement to Pacific Core for our utilities through the southern portion of the Centennial Mills property. And secondly, to amend the Centennial Mills disposition and development agreement that we currently have in place with the prospective buyer, both to reflect the easement and some other associated modifications we've made to the deal terms of that development agreement. Next slide. Before I begin, I want to walk through 2 slides, though, that I think are important to help set the context of this property and the project and our history with it to date. Prosper Portland originally acquired the property in 2000 for the purpose of creating a public park. This effort came to a halt, though, in 2005 after a public outcry over the demolition of the existing structures. At that point, we pivoted and have been working ever since for the past 16 years to pursue redevelopment of the property in alignment with a framework plan that was accepted in 2006. This effort has included negotiation with 4 prospective developers, including our current buyer. It has included an investment in partial demolition to address dangerous situations with some of the existing structure. And over the course of this time, the development obligations have shifted, including removal of an obligation to retain the mountain patrol unit on place, as well as ultimately the removal of a requirement to retain the flour mill on the property as a reflection of just the significant investment that endeavor takes. However, we have retained the obligation to include inclusionary housing on the site as part of the development, and that is embodied in the terms that this board approved in December of 2022. And that action was a significant effort after 16 years to hopefully move this project forward. Next slide, please. That extensive timeline, I think, is reflective of the complexity that's inherent on this property. So the development agreement we have in place requires the developer to take on a number of existing site conditions. This includes removal of in-water pilings that are remaining from the historic piers that were in place, site prep, which would include the extension or the demolition of some or all of the 3 remaining buildings on the site. There is environmental remediation, and it is within the Superfund study area. There are greenway obligations required by code, an obligation for historic interpretive signage on site, and then there's a risk of pending floodplain policy changes that the developer may need to embrace in the future. At the time of approving the development agreement, those obligations were transferred to the developer, and we were aware at the time of PacifiCorp's interest in a utility easement through the site. The utility easement is necessary for them to bury basically an underground cable to allow for the Superfund dredging work to move forward. We didn't want to unintentionally create unintended consequences by granting that easement ahead of working with the developer to better understand the impacts of that. So at the time of approving the development agreement, this board directed the buyer and PacifiCorp to work in good faith to see if they could reach agreement on the terms of this utility easement. Next slide, please. I'm before you today because they have been able to reach agreement. So I'm going to walk through the terms of that transaction as it relates to our development agreement as well. So the negotiated terms have reflected a value of $8.5 million for the easement that reflects both the risk and incremental construction costs and opportunity costs associated with putting the easement to the site. PacifiCorp will pay Prosper Portland $8.5 million for in return, we will grant the easement through the southern portion of the property with the buyer's consent. Click forward. So Prosper will retain $7 million of that payment and provide a pre-development loan with the remaining $1.5 million to our buyer. The buyer will repay that loan in full if they do not close, or will pay the outstanding purchase price balance of $1.25 million if they do close. Click one more. As a result of this structure, Prosper Portland will be fully compensated for the $8.25 million purchase price for the property through the combination of both the initial utility easement payment and repayment of that outstanding balance by the buyer. We also believe under this modified structure, it is more likely that we will incur holding costs, or savings and holding costs, which are currently estimated at $500,000 a year. Next slide, please. Over the course of these negotiations, I think each party obviously had different risks and interests throughout the course of the negotiations. And we believe this deal structure best addresses all 3 parties' interests. Prosper Portland, of course, was concerned about closing on this transaction and the importance of those resources that are needed to fulfill our financial obligations elsewhere in the district, including Bardic Quarter and Old Chinatown, as well as not closing has the risk of needing to continually budget for those $500,000 closing costs per year. Under the structure, we will receive $7 million this month for payment of the easement, and then eventually the outstanding purchase price balance by December 2028. It also has a tighter timeframe for closing on the transaction, which we think will increase the chance of saving on those holding costs. For PacifiCorp, they face obviously mounting pressure to pursue the burying of the cable so that the harbor cleanup work can proceed. There was uncertainty around the location and the timing of that easement, and there were discussions around whether there was advanced soil strengthening work that was needed that would potentially delay their project. Under the terms of this agreement, that work is not necessary. PacifiCorp will get a green light to proceed on the schedule that they need and in the location that they have identified within the property, and will not need to face responsibility for perhaps taking on costs on behalf of our buyer that would have posed cost uncertainty for them moving forward. For the buyer, they have certainty now of the location or greater certainty of the location of the easement within the property and will be compensated for the incremental construction costs of their foundation, as well as the lost opportunity costs of not being able to build high-rise construction due to the incompatibility of that structure with the easement. It also allows them to access the $1.5 million in pre-development funds that were not previously included in the development agreement. Next slide, please. So specifically, the 2 actions before you again, the first is to grant PacifiCorp the easement in exchange for $8.5 million. Prosper Portland will also be reimbursed $600,000, which covers partial costs that we have reimbursed the buyer for his due diligence costs. The easement will include a restriction that prohibits high-rise construction within the easement area. And you can see the diagram here that shows the approximate depth and width across the property. Next slide, please. The second action amends terms of the development agreement. So under the new structure, Prosper will continue to receive $8.25 million as compensation for the property. Now it will be through a combination of both the initial utility easement payment as well as then the reimbursement of that pre-development loan or the outstanding balance of the purchase price. That payment, or the closing, I should say, will occur after demolition permits have been received, and the ultimate payment of that purchase price will be 60 days after the city has issued land use approvals or a back-end date of May 2028. It does now introduce the concept of a pre-development loan of $1.5 million for the buyer to be repaid if they don't close by December of 2024. Next slide, please. Under the current or the existing agreement, there were a number of escrow payments and abilities to buy extensions on the closing. Under the proposed terms, we have removed the escrow payments and we've removed the right to extend the closing. Next slide, please. And then we believe that the deal structure will accelerate the closing. The buyer still has a milestone by which they must submit land use applications, but now, as I mentioned, the buyer will close 60 days after the issuance of demolition permits. They must apply for those demolition permits 60 days from today's approval. The city will then go through their review process and they have 6 days to close. So we believe that through that process, it is likely they will close before December 2024, but we maintain that as a back-end date for closing, just as we had in the prior deal structure, but without the ability to extend that date. The buyer has submitted for the demolition permit for the horse paddock and is working on preparing the demolition permit applications for the second two structures. They may start the work on the paddock and the warehouse before closing, just as they could under the prior agreement, but they could not start demolition of the flour mill before closing. Next slide, please. There are several key terms that remain unchanged in the development agreement. This includes compliance with our business and workforce equity policy, compliance with the green building policy with the previously approved modification that allowed for certification other than LEED, the obligation for on-site inclusionary housing, and that construction must occur within 10 years of closing. As I mentioned previously, the developer also assumes responsibility for the historical interpretive signage, participating meetings with key stakeholders, and removal of the in-water pile remaining wharf structure, as well as the environmental obligations and the risk of the pending floodplain policy changes. Next slide, please. So this diagram, I think, helps just kind of display the differences of the financial transaction. So the existing terms are at the top and the proposed are at the below. So as of this month, under the existing agreement, we would have had either 1 or 2 escrow payments plus the start of a demolition permit application. We are now proposing that we remove the escrow payments and receive the $7 million from the initial escrow utility easement payment. Click forward. Under the existing terms, there was a back-end date again to close on the property of December 2024 with the ability to buy extensions and ultimately having full repayment or full payment of the acquisition price of $8.25 million somewhere in that December 2024-2025 date, but that was tied to land use approvals and this ability to buy extensions. Click forward, please. Under the current structure, again, we have the back-end date to close at December of 2024. We have reason to believe that it will be faster due to the milestones for the demolition permit and the closing now being tied to that timeline. And there's no longer the ability to extend the closing date. At that time, the buyer will become responsible for those holding costs, and that will no longer be a risk for Prosper Portland. And then we will ultimately receive full payment of the acquisition price with a promissory note to be paid 60 days after the land use approval or a back-end date of May 2028. So under this term, this structure, we do receive greater funds sooner and a likely accelerated closing date, but the potential for full repayment would be a couple of years, potentially a couple of years after the prior agreement. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the resources are critical to balancing the River District budget. So this does generate the $8.25 million that we had forecasted out of the $16.25 million in the River District budget. And we believe it will accelerate the timing of those payments, making those resources available for Broadway Corridor and Old Town Chinatown. As I mentioned, we also believe that it will preclude the need to continue to budget $500,000 a year in holding costs after this year. Next slide, please. And then just to wrap up, I think the outcomes and public benefits remain the same as they had on the prior transaction, with the addition of providing the easement to Pacific Port, which allows for the harbor cleanup work to commence. But specific to this property itself, it does generate the resources and the cost savings we discussed. It does further the work of the Centennial's framework plan through mixed-use development of the property, including a greenway trail to be constructed along the riverfront with access to the river being provided, and historical interpretive signage, and the encouragement of reusing the salvaged building materials after the demolition of the existing structures. It does include the requirement of inclusionary housing to be built on site rather than a fee in lieu or an off-site delivery of those units, and compliance with our policies. I believe that's my last slide. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And as I mentioned, Hope is also available.
Great, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. And because this is sort of a unique and long-awaited transaction, I'm going to read kind of a brief summary into the record too. And then after that, we'll circle back and we can actually have some more questions and discussion. So here I go. Two actions are advancing on roughly parallel timelines here. Prosper Portland staff have been working with the Pacific Core team on a potential easement on the Centennial Mills site. At the same time, we offered up the property for sale and found a development partner and agreed upon a sale price. We now know that the Centennial Mills site is the best location for the easement. We also now have a signed development agreement. As a result, the parallel actions have converged. To ensure the easement does not impede the land transaction and private development, Prosper Portland directed the buyer's team to negotiate directly with Pacific Core on the terms of the easement. As a result of the negotiations and agreement, Pacific Core now has certainty on securing the easement and meeting their schedule, which will enable them to deliver on their Superfund obligations. At the same time, the buyer has certainty on pricing to compensate for the impacts and risks associated with the easement. And Prosper Portland is benefiting by receiving compensation for the easement for the benefit of Pacific Core and the buyer, and having those resources to deploy to other commitments in Broadway Corridor and Old Town. Prosper Portland will also be able to take a portion of the proceeds from the sale of the property, $1.5 million, and loan that to the borrower in the form of a pre-development loan to advance the project at this critical stage. So that's the summary. And Sarah, if you'd like to elaborate or correct anything in that, please do so.
Yeah, that was an excellent summary. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll just open it up to questions now. Does anybody have any questions or comments for either Sarah or Hope? No.
I'd just like to, excuse me, I'd like to congratulate everybody. This is a great outcome, given the circumstances, and long in coming. I mean, I think it helps obviously the developer have assurances, but also and Pacific, or which it's also needed it, and but it also I mean, the fact that it allows some money to come right now into the coffers at Prosper is also a great outcome. So it definitely seems like the hard work paid off in a win-win-win situation. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. Does anybody else have anything?
Just want to echo what Sam said, Commissioner Rodriguez said, that congratulations and thanks for the hard work on this, Sarah and Hope, and pulling this together. I know it was a long process, and I really appreciate the work you put into it.
Thank you. Well, I'll just close on this item by just saying that I second those comments, and it's really gratifying to see this come together. This has been pending for a very long time now, as long as Willie and I have been on the commission. So it's very nice to see this happen, and we're just super pleased and really appreciative of all the hard work and flexibility and the savvy negotiating as well. So thank you so much. Okay, well, with that concluded, would somebody like to make a motion to approve resolution number 7482?
Motion to approve.
Thank you.
Coming down
Second.
to Salem
Second.
or wherever we're gonna
Okay.
meet.
Oops, somebody's on there. Okay, well, we do have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. So thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, next up, we have item 5. This is an action item adopting budget amendment number 2 for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2022 and ending June 30, 2023, and making appropriations update on the fiscal year 2023-24 budget development process. And Tony Barnes will lead us through this. Hi, Tony.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chair Cruz, Commissioners, and Executive Director Branham. I'm Tony Barnes, Prosper Portland Finance Manager. And today I'm bringing forward the second budget revision for fiscal year 23-24, budget revision number 2, which is most likely the final budget revision of this fiscal year and included in Resolution 7483. Next slide, please. This budget revision will likely be, as I mentioned, the final budget revision for the year. And with prior spring budget revisions, the purpose of this revision is largely to identify what projects and programs were budgeted this fiscal year that need to be adjusted for carryover and brought into the next fiscal year 23-24. It also incorporates any changes related to the City Council Spring Budget Amendment and any other actions as we close out the fiscal year. Next slide, please. So recapping this last fiscal year, the original budget was adopted in June 2022. And since then, we've trued up total available resources following last year's audit. We had the first budget revision in December. And since December, we've been working with staff to determine how projects, programs, and other expenditures are spending through the year, how funds are being committed, and how those funds are being dispersed. We've also reviewed staffing requirements on a fund-by-fund basis, looking at specific project requirements, and identified what the implications are of the overall City of Portland budget for City General Fund, Cannabis Fund, and other grant resources are for this fiscal year. As with prior years, given that most of our TIF district budgets are capital in nature, we often budget on the higher side of what might be spent during the fiscal year to provide adequate appropriations to facilitate commitment and disbursement of the current fiscal year projects and programs. For example, with the USPS demolition, most of the funding was budgeted this year. And as we're approaching the latter part of this fiscal year, we have a much better approximation of what portion of the budget will be needed this fiscal year and what can move into the proposed budget for next fiscal year. What's more unique about this year, and which was touched upon in the April budget update, is there's a significant amount of American Rescue Plan and general fund resources that were allocated in the original 22-23 budget that represents 2-year funding, which about 2/3 of that is being moved into next fiscal year. Next slide, please. There's 2 key changes on the resources. This is a summary of resources that are included on a fund-by-fund basis in Exhibit A. The 2 key changes are general fund and grant figures that are decreasing a total of $10.5 million in total. This is largely related to shifting funding of one-time funds that were allocated by City Council this year into next fiscal year's budget to support programs and projects. We've also have identified a lot of TIF resources, as I mentioned, that are going to be allocated to next fiscal year and into future fiscal years. The summary of resources includes a decrease of TIF debt proceeds of $10.4 million. This is largely related to the Gateway bond that was issued last fiscal year. The City of Portland Debt Management Office holds the bond resources, and we draw these resources down as projects spend. And those resources in Gateway are not needed at that level this fiscal year, so we'll be incorporating that drawdown into next fiscal year and future fiscal years. I'm also noting here an increase in property income to reflect some higher activity in leasing and parking income. This is primarily in the Interstate TIF District and Convention Center, Oregon Convention Center District related to parking at the Convention Center garage, and then also properties in the Interstate District. Next slide, please. So in summary, total expenditures and appropriations are being reduced by a total of $75 million. I'll discuss some of the key changes in the next several slides, but in summary, most of the changes related to property development activities in the TIF districts and action plan programs and projects. Most of the decrease in expenditures represents cash on hand that we're not spending rather than not drawing down on new TIF proceeds. Therefore, the contingency here is being increased by $55 million. The contingency is functioning as an ending balance, and that will show up as the beginning fund balance or added beginning fund balance in next year's proposed budget. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides touch upon the summary of appropriation changes at a really high level, summarizing the fund by fund changes included in Exhibit A. For administration, there's really two reasons for an increase in administration. It's mostly related to an increase in centralizing personnel costs. Overall, our personnel budget remains unchanged from the amount that was adopted in June of 2022. However, we're reallocating personnel costs from other budget categories, as well as other funding sources where there are savings to help fund the collective bargaining agreement that was put in place in December. The other reason for the increase is to incorporate some additional materials and services costs that were not previously incorporated using the savings from last fiscal year to fund several key activities, including the class comp study that's underway, as well as ongoing external recruiting costs and temporary services to help cover vacancies in the current fiscal year. Next slide, please. In the economic development category, the net decrease is $7 million. This is represented by largely the general fund and American Rescue Plan funding year 2 amount, which now we have a good sense of the end of the fiscal year and how much is being incorporated into next fiscal year. So that's represented by the small business stabilization, Venture Portland allocation, workforce support, the Office of Events and Film, operational funding, as well as some reallocation of personnel costs to that administration category, as I mentioned, in the reallocation of personnel. Next slide, please. In the infrastructure category, it's a net decrease of $2.6 million. Most of this is related to committed funds in the Gateway District related to an LID and street improvements program there. And those funds are incorporated into next fiscal year's budget. There's also some resources for the Chinatown Gate grant that will be, I think, finalizing in the next fiscal year, as well as a quiet zone, a rail crossing improvement in the, I believe, the River District fund. And then next slide, please. The final category is property redevelopment, a net decrease of $62 million. This includes major TIF district action plan investments that are committed in many cases. In some cases, they are lending funds and grant funds available for ongoing programming. This includes commercial lending and lents, the USP demolition, workshop blocks, Central East Side, Old Town Action Plan investments in the River District and downtown waterfront. There's also an agreement with Portland State University supporting investments with PSU, and those dollars are not spending this fiscal year, so we're moving those into later fiscal years. There is some increases to the budget. For example, there have been tenant improvements at 10th and Yamhill this fiscal year. So the build out of that commercial space using funding from PBOT and prior agreement is being mostly implemented this fiscal year, as well as some ongoing property management costs in several districts. And that completes the summary of appropriation changes. And I'd be happy to take any questions from Exhibit A or other questions on the amendment.
Great, thank you, Tony. That's great. To me, it looks pretty similar to what we've seen in prior years in terms of adjusting back and forth. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Tony?
Tony, the TIF debt can you go, I mean, the $10 million delta, what causes that?
Thanks, Commissioner. That's primarily related to bonds that we issued last year in 2022 for the Gateway District. It was the final major bond issuance for the Gateway TIF District. The total issuance had new proceeds of approximately $30 million. It helps the district approach maximum indebtedness, but not quite. And the funding was programmed to go towards affordable housing, the affordable housing set aside, as well as these infrastructure projects in Gateway, as well as additional investments in lending and grants in Gateway. Those resources, the $30 million of programming, we originally allocated, I think, $20 million or $15 million this fiscal year, and $15 million in future fiscal years. And we have enough cash this fiscal year in Gateway to help fund all the activity that is occurring. Therefore, we don't need to draw the bond resources that have been previously issued. So we plan on drawing those issued resources next fiscal year and in future fiscal years. It's really it's a cash management function of cash management more than anything else. The resources are available for us to draw down. It's just not needed at this point in this fiscal year.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much for the summary and good work as always. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve resolution number 7483, adopting the budget amendment?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. We have a second? Thank you. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Great. Passes unanimously. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any further comments or anything else for the good of the order? All
No.
right, if not, then there being no further items on the agenda, the Prosper Portland Board of Commissioners meeting is now adjourned. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, everyone.
Recording stopped.